So today we're going to study about ionic bonding. So basically a compound is a molecule that contains two or more atoms of different elements. There are two types of compounds, ionic compounds or covalent compounds. So here is a noble gas atom which contains maximum 8 electrons in the valence shell. The first shell holds a maximum of 2 electrons, the second shell holds a maximum of 8 electrons, and the third shell also holds a maximum of 8 electrons. This makes the noble gases very unreactive or stable. Ionic bonding is a bonding between a metal and a non-metal. Ionic bonds are made by the transfer of electrons from a metal to a non-metal. And a chemical bond is a force that holds two atoms together. Atoms and electron changes. Every atom would like to have a full outer shell like the noble gases. Atoms can get full outer electron shells by either gaining or losing electrons. A positive ion forms when an atom loses one or more valence electrons in order to attain a noble gas configuration. A positively charged ion is known as a cation. Non-metals, which are located on the right side of the periodic table, easily gain electrons to attain a stable outer electron configuration. An anion is a negatively charged ion. So chemical bonds can form by the attraction between the positive nucleus of one atom and the negative electrons of another atom, or by the attraction between positive ions and negative ions. So today you will learn about bonds that form by the sharing of electrons in later chapter. Today you will learn that how bonds are formed by the transfer of electrons, which is known as ionic bond, and the bonds that are formed by the sharing of electrons are known as covalent bonds. How can a toxic gas and a reactive metal make the salt? So here we will discuss what are the differences between sodium and chlorine. Sodium is a metal, and so the physical state of sodium is solid. It belongs to group 1, and the electronic configuration of sodium is 281. Whereas chlorine is a non-metal, it is gaseous in state, it belongs to group 7 and has an electronic configuration of 287. But both are elements on the periodic table. This is the similarity. Ionic lattices. In an ionic compound, millions and millions of ions are packed, all joined by ionic bonds. This is called a crystal lattice. So basically crystal lattice is formed by the formation of ionic bonds between millions and millions of ionic nuclei. The strong attractions among the positive ions and the negative ions in an ionic compound result in the formation of a crystal lattice. A crystal lattice is a three-dimensional geometric arrangement of particles. In a crystal lattice, each positive ion is surrounded by negative ions, and each negative ion is surrounded by positive ions. Ionic crystals vary in shape due to the sizes and relative numbers of the ions bonded. Sodium gives an electron to chlorine. Once this happens, both of the atoms will now be ions and will each have a charge. Sodium gains a positive charge, whereas chlorine gains a negative charge. oppositely charged ions will now attract each other and form an ionic compound. What are the physical properties of ionic compounds? In an ionic compound, large numbers of positive ions and negative ions exist together in a ratio determined by the number of electrons transferred from the metal atom to non-metal. Melting point, boiling point, and hardness are bulk physical properties of matter that are determined by the strength of electrical forces between particles that make up the matter. Because ionic bonds are relatively strong, ionic crystals require a large amount of energy to be broken apart. Thus, ionic crystals have high melting points, high boiling points. Many crystals, including gemstones, have brilliant colors. These colors are due to the presence of transition metals in crystal states. These are the examples of ionic compounds: sodium chloride, sodium bicarbonate, sodium hydroxide, magnesium sulfate, sodium hypochlorite. What is an ion? An ion is an atom that has an overall charge because it has lost or gained electrons. An ionic bond is formed when electrons that have opposite charges attract. Ionic bond is a bond which happens between a metal and a non-metal. The elements present on the left side of the periodic table are known as metals, whereas the elements on the right side of the periodic table are known as non-metals. Ionic bonding. Let's see the ionic bonding in the table salt. Thousands of compounds contain ionic bonds. Many ionic bonds are binary, which means that they contain only two different elements. Binary ionic compounds contain a metallic cation and a non-metallic anion. Sodium chloride NaCl is a binary compound because it contains two different elements, sodium and chlorine. The one outer electron from the sodium atom moves over to the chlorine atom. Chlorine has now complete shell of 8 electrons, and so does sodium. Since sodium has now lost an electron, the atom has no longer an overall charge of 0. What do you think the charge might be? Think about the electrons and protons usually being in equal amounts. Since sodium has lost an electron, the number of positively charged protons is greater. Now, the sodium atom will have an charge of +1, and we know that a charged particle is known as an ion. This is where the name ionic bonding comes from. The chlorine atom has now gained an electron. So what do you think the charge might be? Because it has gained an electron and electrons are negatively charged, so chlorine will have a negative charge, -1 charge. Ionic bonding. The chlorine gained an electron, electrons are negatively charged, so the chlorine is now negatively charged ion. Sodium transfers one outer electron to chlorine. So, as we have studied that an outer electron is also known as valence electron. What is a valence electron? Valence electrons are the electrons which are present on the outermost shell of an atom. As they transfer the electron, they both become stable and attract. And as we know, the opposites attract and they make a stable compound known as ionic compound. What would magnesium need to do to get a stable full outer shell? What would oxygen need to do to get a stable full outer shell? Can you think of a way that magnesium could lose 2 electrons and oxygen could gain 2 electrons? Why? In order to complete its octet, in order to gain the noble gas configuration. Magnesium will give 2 electrons to oxygen. Once this happens, the magnesium and oxygen atoms each get charge and become ions of opposite charge. Magnesium will get +2 charge and oxygen will get -2 charge. The positive magnesium ions and negative oxygen ions are strongly attracted to each other and form an ionic compound. Ionic bonding is the strong electrostatic force between oppositely charged metal and nonmetal ions. Ions are charged particles which are formed when atoms gain or lose electrons. Cations are positively charged ions, whereas anions are negatively charged ions. So, what today we have learned? We have learned about ionic bonding. And what's the summary? So, first of all, ionic bonds are formed between metals and non-metals. Ionic compounds contain ionic bonds which are formed by the attraction of oppositely charged ions. Ions in an ionic compound are arranged in a repeated pattern known as crystal lattice. Ionic compound properties are related to ionic bond strength. We have also learned that ionic compounds conduct an electric current in the liquid phase and in aqueous solution. An ionic compound whose aqueous solution conducts an electric current is known as electrolyte. Lattice energy is the energy needed to remove 1 mole of ions from its lattice. The electrostatic force that holds oppositely charged particles together in an ionic compound is referred to as an ionic bond. Compounds that contain ionic bonds are known as ionic compounds. If ionic bonds occur between metals and non-metals, oxides form. Most other ionic compounds are called salts.